I'm not sure if Marshall McLuhan...
I'm making this
So this is for Miniclicks at formats, Marshall McLuhan related stuff, the idea of evidence. And I began in a famous graveyard in London, Highgate Cemetery, next to the grave of Patrick Caulfield, looked at the grave of Eleanor Marx and also the grave of Malcolm McLaren. And it occurred to me that Marshall McLuhan had never really said anything about graveyards, gravestones, at least not to my knowledge, but presumably that could have been treated by him in the same way as he did other media. We could see graveyards and gravestones as a form of communication, as a technology, as something which is there to send messages or has an agency of its own, in fact, which is the way that he would have kind of dealt with the question. But they're also evidence there. Evidence that someone once existed and no longer does. They leave some kind of information for us. There's sort of data usually stored on these stones, and selections have been made and space is taken up. It's not a literal or representative attempt, although there is a variety of traditions. There are a variety of traditions globally, obviously, and we've got from cremation to Hindu rituals, and sort of in every culture there are ways of dealing with those that have departed, died. So I mean, I like Patrick Caulfield's gravestone for its wit and unusual and probably for most people unacceptable honesty. It simply says on it, dead. But yes, so we have the graveyard, the gravestone as a medium, not one that's hot by Marshall McLuhan standards. Certainly it doesn't contain high resolution imagery generally relating to the person who passed away, and in a funny way this is where the link with photography comes in, because in the early days of photography, photographs were used in this way as memento. They linked with the concept or the idea of death masks, helped to replace those, I guess. And it was quite convenient that people who are no longer alive remain still because of the exposure times required during the early days of photography in the mid-19th century and so on. So photography is quite different too, in that it's imagery which is easy to be deluded by and quite shocking in that respect, and terrifying in some respects. You know, there's something uncanny about photography which we don't find now because we're so used to it. But presumably this much hotter kind of medium is a different kind of representation and a different kind of evidence that someone existed, but was used initially, as I say, in a very similar way. Now, I want to bring in something else here, which will at first seem bizarre, but the idea of, say, films like the Coen brothers' Fargo, where the female policewoman is, she's trying to discover and find evidence and sort of trace and track down some killers. Likewise with 70s detective series, let's say Columbo, for example, is a classic example and a very interesting one to bring in here. But Peter Falk as Columbo, 70s, 80s, 90s, but primarily it was a kind of 70s thing. His job really was to find evidence and convict people based on that evidence. But he was a dubious case and got away with it because he played the underdog, the clown, the idiot, the fool. He came in from the edges, not typical of how we see police forces, and presumably their political kind of objectives in a way of portraying a police person in this sympathetic way, because we're easily fond of and easily sympathetic to this idea of the underdog. It comes from, let's say, Christianity, it comes from leftist ideologies, it comes from Hollywood, the idea of rags to riches, of someone who is impoverished or oppressed, overcoming the odds against something more powerful. And Colombo is the embodiment of that. But the interesting thing about Colombo, and this is very different to the idea of normal policing as we would understand it, or the idea of collecting evidence and then using that evidence, he very dubiously, and because we sympathize with him, we allow him to get away with this, and perhaps shouldn't, but corruptly, in fact, sets up his targets and entraps them. And in a funny way, this is very analogous to the way photography has changed. Lev Manovich wrote a famous essay, the media theorist from MIT, a famous essay in the mid-90s, which covered this exact topic in a way. He talked about the difference between photography historically and the new digital photography as not being different in the way that we imagined it to be. In reality, what the fundamental difference was that photography had always been something that was about marking the past, immediately imbued with nostalgia and sentiment and a certain kind of melancholy, perhaps, but it was a historical record, or at least that's what it was intended to be, with the possibility for manipulation of imagery and the increase in knowledge about that manipulation and the development of CGI techniques, and he would have used photography as a shorthand for moving image and potentially, if it had emerged at that time, which it hadn't really, immersive gaming environments. These environments are also examples of photography, but these are created worlds which are not real, which are based on the real, but sort of embellished and changed in some way. And his suggestion was that this was very like socialist realism. In other words, it was something, or in totalitarian regimes of any sort, Soviet socialist realism, fascist sorts of imagery. And it was there with an objective in mind to kind of affect people and to kind of give them a picture of how they should look and how they should be and what they should be aiming for. So it was directive. And this was the point that Lev Manovich is making about contemporary image making and photography. If you extend that argument, which he didn't, but to me at least, the natural extension of that argument is as follows. The fashion for cosmetic surgery, you could argue, comes from Photoshop, from the ability to manipulate images. Now that's a simplistic point to make, but I think there potentially is something in it that's of interest. And lastly, there's something, and this relates to my own work in a way. So the idea of documentation is very important. The idea that you can manipulate imagery and that might be somehow dubious and directive. Work, for example, but if we think of the Colombo case, he's entrapping, where I was and in a funny way that can backfire. So I was looking at the photographs that traffic wardens use in Britain as evidence of dubious parking, as evidence of bad parking, as a means of finding people and providing evidence for that. And when I looked through hundreds of these images, which I had managed to accumulate over a period of years as part of a project of mine, contravention, I discovered many in which the traffic warden themselves, correctly termed CEOs, or civil enforcement officers, yes, they share an acronym with the leaders of multinational corporations as if to emphasize their power and importance. But occasionally the traffic wardens, the civil enforcement officers, capture themselves in reflection and are so, in other words, they're exposed by their own technology, they're exposed by their own system, which is meant to be about surveillance of others. So there are interesting things going on in the world now, and I think I've, in a bizarre way, made connections between graveyards, can be a kind of 1970s detective series like Colombo, and of course I forgot to mention Sophie Call's famous work from the early 1980s, which was actually called Detective and was about photography, and it was about asking a detective who didn't know this, but who was following Sophie Call, the artist, around and taking pictures and making notes about her, which would then be fed back to her via her own mother. And this was a famous piece of work that's very advanced and very preempts a lot of what's going on now. But so these connections between graveyards, between the history of photography, and thirdly 70s detective series don't seem as peculiar as all that when we think of the question and what evidence is. I think that's it. I'll say goodbye to format and mini clicks now.